we'll just get right into it. So I'm really happy to welcome this week's guest to our latest installment of the Nonhuman Rights Project seminar series, which of course, is an idea that we've thought about and talked about for a long time, but was really kicked into high gear with the COVID-19 pandemic and trying to find ways to keep folks engaged and educated and really just fired up about the issue because while the world is going through a whole lot of changes right now, the good thing from our perspective at Nonhuman Rights Project is that we're still very busy. Indeed, we're kind of busier than ever in a lot of ways. And we continue to see cases come down that support the goal that we're aiming for, which is creating the first rights for non-human animals or forcing the recognition of those rights. So I'm very excited today to welcome Letitia Meynell. We just talked about the proper pronunciation of her name. So Letitia is someone who we've been fortunate to know and work with for a number of years now in the context of our Philosophers brief, which we'll talk about. But before we get into that, I want to just give a brief introduction of Letitia and how we got to know her. So Letitia is an associate professor of philosophy and gender and women's studies at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia in Canada. Beautiful campus. I was lucky to be there last year. Her current work looks mostly at the evolution, I should say, the science of evolution and scientifically informed analyses of the moral and legal status of non-human animals, which of course is music to our ears. And she's co-edited 2 collections of essays and written a number of journal articles and book chapters. And of special significance to us, over the last few years, Letitia has been really a key part of a team of philosophers around North America that have co-authored 3 amicus briefs now on behalf of the Nonhuman Rights Project and our clients. 2 of them in support of chimpanzees Tommy and Kiko in New York, and another in support of elephants Minnie, Karen, and Beulah in Connecticut in our ongoing appeal there. And the first of these was extended into a book called Chimpanzee Rights, the Philosopher's Brief, which I highly recommend to folks. There it is. It's got that beautiful cover. And we actually, Nonhuman Rights Project gets the proceeds of the sale of that book, which we're very generous for and appreciate very much. And like I said, Letitia and another philosopher, or her partner in crime in many ways, Andrew Fenton, led a group of 17 philosophers I mentioned. And for folks who have, an awareness of the philosophical craft, getting 17 of them to agree on something is, I think, a massive, victory in and of itself. And the fact that it, and this is something I want to talk about more because it's just really exciting. The concurring opinion of Judge Fahey in New York, which was also in Tommy's and Kiko's cases. Folks may be hopefully familiar with that. I'm convinced, just reading it, that the Philosopher's Brief, Letitia's work and everyone's work was really instrumental in making that happen by giving the judges something beyond the law to really latch onto, because so often we see judges who, have this very reactive kind of view of the law. If it's not written down somewhere, that's not the law. But we know that's not how the law works. The law has never worked that way, especially not with an issue like this, where we're talking about the fundamental rights and extending them beyond our species for the first time. So very excited to welcome Letitia. And I'd just like to start it off. How did you get interested in the lives and interests and well-being of non-human animals?
So I think, like many people, my first awareness of animals as non-humans, other than humans, as real beings, was with the relationship of my cat as a child. My cat was my 4th birthday present, and she died when she was 21 and I was 25. And when she died, I realized that was the most consistent relationship in my life, right? I mean, my relationship with my parents, obviously, between 4 and 25 had changed a lot. But my cat had been a kind of crucial part of my life. Had been a friend or family member. I mean, it's a kind of unique relationship that we had. And I think this is the normal experience of companion animals. So that was part of caring about other animals. I've always been interested in natural history. My parents are birders, so paying attention to animals around me. And then my relationship with Andrew, when we first got together, he was doing PhD research on the cognitive capacities of other animals. And as he did research on the cognitive capacities of X, and, you know, if they were food animals, you know, we stopped eating pigs, and then we stopped eating cows, and then we stopped eating chickens. And of course, it doesn't make any sense to still have eggs. And gradually we ended up being vegans. And then we really went from there, right? Just looking and getting beyond the kind of ideology of anthropocentrism, which is structural in our society.
Great. So going off of that, you know, anthropocentrism and, you know, the centrality of it, could you just give folks a brief outline of the Philosopher's Brief, just the structure of it and the kind of main arguments that you guys were able to make?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a little bit of a historical background on how the brief came about, because Andrew and I were at a conference that was actually hosted by Laurie Marino, who I gather you're going to be talking to in another couple of weeks. And Steve was just coming in to give a presentation at that. He couldn't be there for long. And so we heard his presentation, very impressed. And of course, Andrew in particular knew about his work. And we were walking by the bar and we saw Steve in the bar, and Andrew went, because Andrew's very friendly, I probably wouldn't have done this, went up to Steve and said, you know, this is really great. We're philosophers. What can we do to help? And Steve said, oh, maybe you could write an amicus brief. And then happily, he was going to be in Nova Scotia just a couple of months later, because our law students, our animal law student society had invited him for a screening of Unlocking the Cage. And so that gave Andrew and I some time to actually read the rulings on Tommy and Kiko's cases and think about what philosophers might be able to say about that. And so we sat down with Steve and we proposed 2 different kinds of briefs that we imagined being able to write. And Steve said, sure. And so we started off with 2, and then Andrew started asking people to sign on, and we ended up with this huge crew. I kept saying, stop. But we decided that we couldn't, it would be very difficult to write a positive brief, so a positive idea about what personhood is that everyone could agree with. But it was quite easy to write a negative brief where we could say, look, here are all the ways in which the justices are using the word personhood. They're in the literature, that's true. We noticed 4 different ways that they were using the word personhood. But the problem was that they were equivocating between the different uses. And so in an argument, you would find them shifting from one use of personhood to another use of personhood. And of course, that meant that the argument was a poor one, right? If the key idea in your argument keeps on changing from premise to premise, you will not end up with a good argument at the end of the day. So basically, the brief just says, look, within these rulings, you've got these 4 different conceptions of personhood. 3 of them are just fine. They're not obviously wrong. But according to those 3 interpretations of person, Tommy and Kiko actually are persons. The 4th one is a poor conception of personhood. And that's the one that takes species membership to be all that there is to being a person. Of course, we argued, look, species membership, that's a biological category. It's just a taxonomic category. There are species, there are genuses, there are families, there are orders. Why are you using this biological taxon? Why do you think this has any moral force whatsoever? If you're going to say it has moral force, what you actually need to do is give us another argument. and say what it is about that taxon that means that it deserves special legal protections. But if you do that, it's those other criteria that are actually doing the moral work. And that's where you're likely to depend on one of the other three definitions, maybe another one, who knows. There's a whole bunch of different views about what makes a person. And so those criteria will be doing the moral work. So that was the kind of basic argument of the brief. And it meant that we didn't actually have to agree on what the right definition of person was, which is a good thing because we don't agree. You know, I don't really have an opinion. I'm a philosopher of science. I don't know about that stuff, right? It's just, you know, it's not what I'm trained in. Yeah, so that's a kind of overview. That's helpful. Do you have any questions? Did I miss something out?
No, that's great. And I love that you talked about personhood, because I was hoping to get into that a little bit. Folks listening to this, I'm sure will have heard it from us a lot. We talk about personhood a lot. But I think in my experience, I've seen this firsthand, folks really, they get the wrong idea about it, and it can cause a lot of confusion and rancor in certain circumstances, especially outside of the kind of narrow, really arbitrary confines of the law, what the law considers to be a person. So just for clarity's sake, when we talk about being a person, we mean in a person in the eyes of the law, all that means is an entity that has the capacity for legal rights or duties. So of course, a human being, we can now take for granted that every human being in the world is a legal person. But for most of the history of this concept, you know, up until barely 150 years ago, not every human being was a person. Notably, slavery is the most vicious example of this, but there are many others where human beings were not treated as full persons in the eyes of the law. And
like
conversely,
women.
Of course.
I always want to remember, you know, the laws of coverture. Husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband, right? The sort of disappearance of the personhood of women, which is so much part of the common law tradition.
Totally. And you know, that's one just kind of, I think, very vivid example of how the common law has over time not only, well, gotten things wrong, but eventually evolved, which is very key to our arguments, right, when we go into court. And so what I love about the Philosopher's Brief, it's one of my favorite things that has been filed in our cases, because I think it really draws in all these different strands of thought, and I think ties them together in a very convincing way. And I also love that it's logical, right? Which people might assume that that's what the law is about, but oftentimes it is not, right? It doesn't follow this path of logic necessarily. And that, you know, it's a key part of why we went to seek out the help of philosophers, because we knew that the judges were getting this wrong in a philosophical way that we just are not capable of, you know, doing justice to and deconstructing in the way that you all are. And so the brief, you know, starts with, I think, this great observation that, you know, we're talking about legal personhood. Currently under our system, you can be a thing or you can be a person. You know, a thing cannot have the capacity for rights, while a person, like I mentioned, can have that capacity. That's really the main difference. And right now, there's no third option. There's no other box that anything can fit into, again, in the eyes of the law. And I think sometimes when people hear us talk about personhood an awful lot, they think, well, these guys really like this idea. I mean, it's a fine idea and all, but the thing that I think you guys really hone in on is that we're not necessarily endorsing it. We're saying right now, this is the only way that you can have rights at all. And so I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about, you know, what you think of this concept of personhood and how, if at all, it has, you know, changed or kind of evolved, or you've added to it in the context of, you know, jumping into the philosophy of law, which, like you said, you never really set out to do.
No idea. No, indeed. So I think, and this is where you really need, for some of your question, a historian of ideas who can look at the way the word personhood has been used in many different traditions and has evolved over time. Certainly, it's been important in a lot of ways in the legal and recent political and moral traditions of the so-called West, just really obviously, and the ways in which the legal traditions of the so-called West have extended to ideas of universal human rights and things like that. So it's been a kind of politically and morally powerful idea, but it's always had this tendency to slip and slide. And that's part of why you could have things like the sheer brutality of chattel slavery happen at the same time that the people who are founding the United States are talking about the fundamental rights of all persons, right? And so that weird contradiction is made possible by it being this slippery term. That slippery term has made it in some ways useful for moral progress, but it's also meant that it's been amenable to manipulation and really, well, and to atrocities, right? So for me, as a kind of philosopher I am, I will say, well, you want to be really precise about what exactly you mean, right? And this is really what the brief was all about. Let's get clear on what you might mean, and then you can tell us what you do mean. But you're not going to be able to give us a convincing argument unless you're clear about what you mean and you use that concept in a consistent way. And that's what they haven't been doing with the way they use the word person. So yeah, I mean, I would say that it's just really important for us to be clear and precise. If you want your reasoning to be good, you want to make it as clear and as precise as possible. And I think that, you know, some of the ways in which rhetoric and certainly our contemporary political discourse is working is that it's, you know, very much about moving people to anger and making use of sloppy concepts that kind of get you riled up, instead of saying, right, we need to, you know, have open, compassionate hearts and careful, rigorous minds and navigate our legal, political, and moral space that way. And so for me, personhood is a kind of fundamentally problematic term because it keeps on slipping and sliding around, and I can't evaluate any claims you're making using it until you nail it down. And so depending on how you nail it down, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. The weird ways in which it's come to be taken up in law, where I know corporations, I don't think they are persons, but you can treat them as persons. I think there's some kind of little piece of
well, they're juridical persons as opposed to natural persons. They draw this, there's a distinction in the literature between these two ideas, you know, an artificial person, but they are, in the eyes of the law, still a person, you know, a thinking, well, not thinking, but
they're
you know,
not thinking.
A litigating thing, a litigating person thing.
So again, that seems like such, you know, it's a kind of result of the history of the common law that we've got to this point, but it doesn't really make any sense. And so, yeah, we need to try and make better sense. Just in terms of something you said earlier, and I'm going to push back on it because I've been talking about precision. You know, when you say that all human beings are persons, I mean, human being is another really slippery word. Are you emphasizing the being, right? Or are you making a point, again, simply about species membership? Because if you're just talking about Homo sapiens, then, you know, an embryo, a fertilized egg is a Homo sapien. It's a member of that species. A brain dead body, right? Which still, you know, the kind of thing that has organs harvested from it is a living, breathing, in important ways, member of the species Homo sapiens, but we don't think it's a human being, which is why doctors aren't committing murder when they take living organs out of someone who is basically in the process of dying. And so, you know, even though we sort of tend to say, well, of course, all human beings, you're like, okay, not quite all. Who are you talking about? Let's get really precise, and notice what we're valuing, which is the living of life, right? The rich life of the various different ways that humans live it, and the ways that other animals live lives that are relevantly similar. That's a kind of point, I take it, of what the Nonhuman Rights Project is doing, saying, let's have a look at the richness of human lives. Let's just articulate what it is about them that matters, and then notice that other animals share those features, at least some of them do.
I think that's a really good point. And, you know, it reminds me, listening to you talk about the so-called argument for marginal cases, which we've talked about, yeah, I think, quite a bit. Yeah. Do you have some thoughts on that? Because I know, you know, I thought, if I'm not mistaken, you were doing some recent scholarship around that idea, or looking at it a little more deeply.
So I've been thinking about, I mean, yeah, the very idea of marginal cases is, to me, already problematic. So the way I think about it is very much as a philosopher of biology. And, you know, biology is crucially, in part, about evolution. So there's a famous phrase by Dobzhansky that nothing makes sense in biology except in light of evolution. And when you look at evolution, what it tells you, evolution by natural selection anyway, if evolution by natural selection is going to happen at all, there has to be variation within a population. You cannot have selection unless there's varieties within a population that differ, so that there can be differential replication of the members of the population. And so, you know, the problem with the whole idea of marginal cases is it seems to say some members of the human population, well, they're the real humans, and the others are somehow lesser humans. And again, biologically, that makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense. There's all kinds of variation in any population, and all members of that population will be the members of the species that they are members of the species of. The species membership is determined by lineage. What matters is who your parents are. That's what determines what species you belong to. And so I find the very way that marginal cases is set up, those arguments seem to take a certain group of humans and make them the measure of all other humans. And I think that is extremely dangerous, because lo and behold, we find those other humans who aren't the paradigm humans tend to experience exploitation and oppression in ways that are, you know, morally outrageous quite often. So that's where I find just the whole way of thinking about morality that makes marginal cases a meaningful concept bothers me. Does that help?
Well, yeah, it does. And, you know, it's interesting because there's one individual whose name you're familiar with, Professor Cupp, who's written a number of, we talk about amicus briefs, which you've written for us, which is amicus curiae is Latin for friend of the court. It's when the court, this is a routine thing in all kinds of cases, when the court will allow outsiders who aren't party to the case to insert briefs or argue sometimes, and basically to flesh out areas of the case or dispute that just aren't captured in the law. And so this Professor Cupp has made kind of a cottage industry of writing articles about our cases and why personhood, that is the capacity for rights, should be restricted to humans. And he kind of often accuses us of using this marginal case analogy or, you know, argumentation in a way that is, he says, I think the latest tact is that it is kind of diminishes human concern for vulnerable humans. Do you think there's any kind of independent strength to that kind of statement. The idea that essentially that by extending rights and personhood beyond humanity, that we're suddenly or necessarily devaluing what might be seen as more vulnerable humans in the process.
I don't think that's true at all. I would love to see the examples historically that Cup has in mind, where you see concern for animals other than human being intimately connected with certain humans losing their rights. I think that's actually the inverse of the way it's tended to go historically. And so, you know, early, and again, you need a historian of ideas here much more than you need me, philosopher of science.
Mm-hmm.
From what I understand, the early children's rights movement in, again, the sort of so-called West, North America, Europe, was tied up with the animal rights movements as well in the Victorian era. So, yeah.
In fact, yeah, there was an ASPCA, and this is a kind of very surprising story in the late 1800s. The first ASPCA, Henry Bergh, if I'm not mistaken, founded it in New York because he was so aghast at the treatment of carriage horses. Mm-hmm. And that was actually before there was any kind of really child welfare agency. So it was common for orphan children, people, if they came upon one or knew of one, they would actually call the ASPCA because there was no one else to call. So yeah, indeed, these things were all very, you know, the anti-slavery movement, the women's rights movement, the early, you know, child's rights, workers' rights, they all kind of seem to germinate from the same, you know, kind of thing. And I think that's powerful.
So I think one reason why people make this mistake is because of another kind of powerful equivocation that's part of our language. And that's an equivocation over the word animal. So animal gets used in two ways. It gets used in a biological way, and it gets used in a political way. So you can really notice this when you see how the meaning of being accused of being an animal can shift, right? So in a biological sense, we are all animals, right? So the human-animal distinction makes no sense. It is as meaningful as the lobster-animal distinction or the, you know, aardvark animal distinction. Yes, you can take any species of animal and distinguish it from all the other animals. And when you talk about the human-animal distinction from a biological perspective, that's the best kind of meaning we can make of it, sloppy speaking, because of course, humans are animals. So that's the biological meaning. But then the political meaning is really about being human and being subhuman. And so the ways in which people, when they are being oppressed, are animalized. And so, you know, the Shoah, the Holocaust, you could see Nazis using animalizing stereotypes against Jews as a way of indicating their subhumanity so as to make possible the final solution, right? And so there you can see the human-animal distinction is this extremely powerful way of risking humans, right? Of saying, if you don't quite measure up for whatever our society takes to be the paradigmatically human, you are at risk of this kind of animalizing oppression. And we find animalizing oppression happens to people with disabilities. We find animalizing oppression happens to religious minorities. You can see it with anti-Muslim rhetoric at the moment. You can see it happening to sexual minorities, the animalizing oppression, which has always come along with homophobia. And so that human-animal distinction gets mixed up with the biological one. And so I think that people who ardently care about the well-being and the rights of humans who often are marginalized in our society, they get worried when they see people like the Nonhuman Rights Project trying to elude this human-animal distinction, because they want to see all of the animalized humans being treated as truly human. But I would say we need to get rid of the human-animal distinction, because it actually is what makes it kind of conceptually possible to put humans into this subhuman category, to treat them as animals. If we get rid of that way of thinking, I mean, not only is it going to be better for animals who aren't humans, but it's going to be better for a whole bunch of humans who, because of where they fit in our society, are at risk of brutal forms of oppression.
Yeah, I know there's some great, writing on that. Silko comes to mind as somebody who I look to kind of unpack that issue. I think it's a very important one, and I think it kind of goes to show just how much cultural, philosophical baggage that we all have, being a product of this culture. And the thing is that I think sometimes people forget, especially judges and lawyers and academics, is that judges are people too. They're humans too. They have emotions and philosophies and outlooks that they may try to hide or, sort of act so that they're always acting in an impartial manner. But the reality we know to be quite a bit different. And I think that's why being able to unpack this stuff a little bit, or have folks like you come in and educate the court, has just been, I think, clearly so helpful. So I wanted to ask on that note about your opinion, or, your impressions of reading Judge Fahey's concurring opinion, because I think it was quite powerful. And, but I'll preface that a little just to describe or make sure we're all on the same page. Mm-hmm. So that, again, came about from Tommy's and Kiko's cases, which Letitia and the other philosophers, that was the first time that we did one of these philosophers briefs. In the past, and I'm glad you mentioned this idea of the idea we were just talking about, because I think it really follows nicely from last week's seminar that we did with Justin Marceau. He's a law professor, habeas corpus scholar, another one of our amicus curiae folks. And the talk last week was all about how the focus of the animal protection movement writ large on largely incarcerating humans as a way of showing the seriousness of animal interests. So, in an animal cruelty scenario, really throwing the book at people. And for a long time, that was the prevailing model of the, again, I use animal protection movement because it's a pretty disparate set of groups. And we are very much now consciously trying to move against that. And for one reason is that we know that we're not going to be very successful in building bridges with, like you said, these groups that are concerned chiefly, justifiably so, with various groups of vulnerable humans. I think it's really important for us to, stress the message that, there are many ways that we can uplift animals in the legal system, and it does not have to necessarily come at the expense of human liberty, or indeed dehumanizing or otherwise kind of neglecting the interest of humans. So yes, that's really important. And if anyone wants more on that topic, I suggest checking out last week's episode. So about Fahey, the decision that really got us to first recognize that we had a real kind of philosophical problem on our hands when we set out to solve a legal problem was in 2014 with the Lavery decision we often refer to. That was the first time we brought a habeas petition on behalf of Tommy. The case you got involved with was the second time. And Lavery gave us the decision for the first time in Western legal history that we're aware of, that legal personhood, again, the capacity to have any rights at all, is dependent on, the being in question, the entity in question, having the corresponding ability or capacity to take on legal duties and responsibilities. And they said that chimpanzees and all other animals don't have it, only human beings have it. And that necessarily prevents non-human animals from being the recipients of even the most fundamental legal rights. And Judge Fahey's concurring opinion, which, while it's not a full opinion or a full win, was really the first time ever that an American high court judge has talked about this issue in a written opinion. And he specifically, I think largely on the basis of your amicus brief and some other things that were introduced in the case, very much went against that. He said that, this is not how we determine who gets to be a person. So I was hoping you could kind of talk about that idea specifically, why it's such a bad idea to, from your perspective, to premise legal rights on this, capacity to bear duties. And just more importantly, though, what did you feel reading Fahey's opinion? Because I'm curious how a non-lawyer, reacted to it, because we, continue to be really excited by what's in it.
Well, I think we were certainly pleased that clearly that he'd read the brief. And so from what you and Steve had said, we weren't particularly confident that it would be read.
True.
It's long. So we hit as academics often do, we hit the maximum page length or word length of 7,000 words pretty comfortably. So, we thought it was pretty clear, but quite long. For my own part, obviously I was happy that this seemed legally significant. I'm still not sure I really understand the legal minutiae. It still breaks my heart, particularly for Tommy, if Tommy is still alive, that his situation, Kiko's situation isn't great, but Tommy's just atrocious. And so manifestly wrong. And I guess the fact that Fahey did use phrases like, I think he says manifest injustice somewhere, or maybe I just said that. Anyway, he uses strong language that was actually stronger than the language we used in the brief. So that, that certainly made us take note, or made me take note. In a lot of ways, in terms of my personal experience of the whole process, I was just so relieved when the brief actually got submitted to the court, because, what was keeping me up at night was the thought that perhaps having used, 16 of my colleagues' time and sort of driven them and through this arduous, painful writing process, it took months and months, and was, herding cats the whole way. I worried that the NhRP would look at it and say, oh, this doesn't really fit with our strategy. Sorry. And I just sort of go, oh, it's completely pointless. Sorry, people. But
we would have pretended, if that was the case, I would have pretended rather than break your hearts. And I never would have done that.
Thanks so much. Well, one wants to be useful, but that for me was when I felt a huge amount of relief and achievement, was just that it got submitted. If we can actually through this process, eventually, if the Nonhuman Rights Project can eventually win, then I'll feel really very humbled to have had a role in that.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned, because sometimes I think as lawyers, we can get a little too excited about the words on paper, which, that's our craft. And it is always important to, keep in mind that while we are seeing progress, individuals like Tommy, Kiko, Happy, others, so many others, their situation is not yet improved. And so I can certainly understand why, people might hear this or see this and think, well, it's great, you got these judges to say things, but when do they take that next step? And I view it as our job to kind of keep pushing them. And you mentioned something earlier that, and I wanted to talk about this and give you an opportunity to speak a little bit more broadly. And
just before you do,
oh yeah,
I just want to say, but Hercules and Leo did get out. And they are in sanctuary, and that wouldn't have happened. I don't believe that would have happened without the Nonhuman Rights Project. And so, even that there are real wins that matter. It's just, like I say, especially Tommy. So.
No, that means the world to us. And, you know, I think another
Yes.
thing that we take heart from is looking at the history of social change, especially working through the law.
Yeah.
On a day-by-day basis, it can feel like a real grind or a series of heartbreaks or hitting your head into a wall, but you have to always be able to take this more, you know, further out
Long view.
perspective and see that
Yep.
things actually are moving. I think we periodically need to almost give ourselves a little time to see that, yes, we actually are making progress, because these ideas we were talking about, animals not being able to have rights, have been around for thousands of years. And so, but you mentioned something earlier that, you know, I think I wanted to push a little bit more on and get more from you on, because I know it ties into other areas of your work. So the intersections that you see between feminist theory and, you know, different trends in biology, and how those work into not just our kind of case, but also, you know, the more broad question of moral and, you know, the moral and legal rights and interests of non-human animals, and particularly how you see, you know, feminist theory working to, you know, any places where you think it would perhaps criticize our approach or other approaches, or, you know, just how you see those two kind of disciplines potentially working together, maybe better.
So for me, one thing that I've always, well, maybe not always, over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly noticed is the ways in which androcentrism and anthropocentrism mirror each other, right? So the ways in which male supremacy and human supremacy have similar kinds of logics, have similar ways of, frankly, making people stupid and just say stupid things and not notice the obvious. And so at the theoretical level, that's what I find really useful, is kind of recognizing, particularly in the sciences, again, because I'm a philosopher of science, that's what I'm mostly looking at, is how androcentric ideas and anthropocentric ideas have this interesting relationship and mirror each other in interesting kinds of ways. So with the anthropocentrism, I mean, it's amazing to me that people still talk in terms of higher and lower organisms, when that very idea seems to be premised on a great chain of being. Don't make any sense in terms of evolution. It fits this very, very old idea in the so-called West of, you know, God at the top, angels underneath, man, and yes, we mean man, because we usually just forget about women altogether. And depending on whose great chain of being it is, at which point in history, it will be white men. And then you get under them the great apes and other animals, and then plants, and then sort of sludge, and then rocks, right? This, and you know, higher and lower organisms, or people will talk about more or less evolved. It just, I don't even know what you're talking about. I really don't. Do you mean, I mean, there are things that idea is catching on, but it's so poorly expressed that way. And it so poorly informs our way of thinking. So with the great chain of being, because people think of higher and lower organisms and humans as the highest, it means that every other animal is understood in terms of what doesn't it have that humans do have, as opposed to saying, what capacities do they have? Right? What are they missing? What capacities do they have? There are some capacities that some animals or some non-human animals are going to have, which are better by some important standard than human ones. That's okay. Why would that even be surprising? That seems like a disruptive thought. It's because you've got your mindset structured by the great chain of being. So that's a way in which anthropocentrism tacitly structures a whole bunch of conversations in science and in society more broadly, and in scientifically informed decisions in society, which is really troubling to me.
I think, yeah, that's so important. I think I'm glad you brought up the great chain of being, because that's something that I was hoping would come up, because like you said, it's anti-scientific. It, I think, objectively makes us stupider in our behavior and our decisions and our thinking. But it also, I think, to kind of come back to this idea of judicial realism, it really is beaten into all of us. And so even if you don't think necessarily in these terms, the fact is that a description like you just laid out of talking about a non-human having a greater capacity, I think it does hit most people in a weird way, because of we have this ingrained programming. And I think to go back to this idea, one of my favorite anecdotes that I think illustrates this kind of perfectly is one of our founding board member, Jane Goodall, who is still at it. She's a lot of people's hero, including my own, and for many reasons. But I think the thing that I often come back to when I think about what Jane's done for most of her life, when she first set out to study chimpanzees and their behavior, she was not part of the scientific establishment. She wasn't even, I don't even think she had an official degree at that time. She just went out and did it.
I think she had a first degree.
She had her first degree, but she didn't have any kind of post, right? Yeah.
No.
And so by all metrics, this was in the 50s, 60s. Who is this woman who's out here naming chimpanzees, talking about them, in terms of, giving them individual names? She was accused of anthropomorphizing, which I find very ironic, because in the last 50 years, the entire scientific world has come around to see that, no, actually, it's the complete opposite. By ignoring these things that are, parsimony, as it's called, if an animal is doing something very much in a way that a human would do it, it's the, simplest explanation to say, actually, they're probably working on a very similar set of, dynamics that the human is. And to have that now be, I think, we're not completely there yet, but I think that this idea of people using anthropomorphizing as a sort of scientific, this deepest scientific slur that you could throw out there, mm-hmm. I just see it less. Do you see it less? I certainly see it less these days.
I think so. I mean, it's still there. It's important to pick out what's right about the idea. I would rather get rid of the term altogether and just talk about false ascription or ascription errors, right? Sometimes you falsely ascribe a trait to an organism that it doesn't actually have, just like sometimes you miss ascribing a trait to an organism that it actually does have. We make mistakes. And the ascription of traits is one of those places where, of course, biologists are going to make mistakes. But putting it in terms of anthropomorphism has created this hypersensitivity that has made a whole bunch, it's just twisted a whole bunch of science. And thinking of it simply in terms of you can make this type of error of ascription is a more, well, it's a less politically imbued concept, right? It's just a kind of error that you want to make sure you don't make.
Good old-fashioned logical errors. There's this big map that has it's like drawings of all the logical errors that you can make, an ad hominem and this. I think everyone should have that hanging on their wall. You can spot them left and right. So I think we're almost out of time. This has been really great, but I wanted to leave a little time for questions. I have some from folks that are listening in. But before that, I wanted to ask what you're working on now and, what you're excited about. And
So I'm probably working on too many projects now. In fact, I know I am. So I'll just mention a couple. One is I'm working with a biologist on his new concept of evolution, which is called It's the Song, Not the Singers. I'm not going to explain what that means, but what's interesting about it is that it is one of these big kind of reframing how we think about the relationships between organisms and moving beyond a kind of dog-eat-dog world or dog-eat-dog model of natural selection to things that are more symbiotic, which I think is an important kind of way of rethinking our relationship with other organisms in the world more generally. And so things like, your gut bacteria. Your gut bacteria works with you for you to function. You will not thrive without billions of other organisms in and on your body doing their thing. And so, that kind of reframes the way we think about ourselves in the world. And then the other thing that we're hoping to do is figure out how to be helpful to the Whale Sanctuary Project. So as some folks listening may know, the Whale Sanctuary Project, which is looking to set up a sanctuary for whales, it is what it sounds like, is going to be coming to Nova Scotia. And so we're hoping that we'll find ways to collaborate with them and show them that philosophers can be useful too, just the same way we showed the Nonhuman Rights Project that philosophers can be useful.
Well, yeah, you definitely showed us, because we are, you guys are working on another one for us, right? In Happy's Appeal.
Yeah.
And we're really excited about that for reasons that we've talked about in other seminars, but that is coming up in, I believe, the next couple months. And so I think folks should definitely watch out for that, because it will, like a lot of our legal arguments, I think, build on what you guys have done already, but I think there's some really interesting new material that we can kind of constantly be adding it to. So that's great. So thank you, Letitia, so much for taking the time and for all that you do. And Mickey, I think if you're there, how best should we do our questions? Are you going to be our MC?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, I have a question from Jane. She asks, which philosopher from history would you point to as a strong animal rights advocate?
Oh, gosh, you're so asking the wrong person. This is where Andrew would know so much better than I would. And I noticed that he's in the audience, but I don't know if he's listening anymore. But
type it into the box.
I'll ask Andrew if he can think of a good historical or philosopher from history who's good about animal rights. Who would that be? I don't know. I really don't.
It's interesting, I think that I will say, we did see a decision the other day that we've really excited about from Pakistan. The High Court of Islamabad was faced with a legal question very similar to the ones that we present. And I thought it was fascinating that he spent a good part of his decision actually describing what he sees as the pro-animal teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And
interesting.
Why that's, and he actually goes to some length so I'll have to share that. But that's a whole other, I see it as a sort of related area. We're actually branching into trying to get faith leaders to weigh in too, because I think, they have an obvious place for to add these moral, these moral considerations that we lawyers, we can't deal with.
Yeah, I think it's also, it's, if you think about various religious traditions as kind of wisdom traditions, obviously some of the ways in which Buddhist stories talk about compassion for other animals, or King Ashoka in the Indian tradition, right? He's a very important animal, at least welfare advocate. And, we're talking 2,000 years ago, or, I think looking at the way indigenous groups in North America think about relationship with other animals. So when we were talking about the great chain of being before, you're not going to find people who are kind of deeply embedded in an indigenous ontology making the same mistakes about the great chain of being, because they're absolutely tuned into the idea that other animals and indeed plants may have lessons for us and have capacities that we can learn from, and that they're not just lesser, right? That's very much a kind of framing that you get rolling out of the traditions of Europe, other places too, for sure. Yeah, looking to other kinds of cultural traditions, I think, can be really useful for disrupting some of our own biases, which are so entrenched that we can't even see them until we try and take an external view.
Andrew was listening in. He says, depends on what you mean by rights.
Of course, I love that answer.
Ask a philosopher.
You got to. What's next, Mickey?
All right.
I see them coming in now.
Yeah.
I thought we would.
Oh gosh, they're coming in fast.
No, we might not have time for all of them, but we'll do our best.
Okay. Here's a question from Katie. She asks, do you think that the original taxonomic classifications from the 1700s into species, genus, etc., are largely responsible for a lot of the problems we see today?
So, I think taxonomic classification is absolutely essential for doing biology, right? You got to classify. I think, one of the problems with the taxonomy is, to some extent, it's kind of arbitrary. So when we were writing the first amicus brief, I did some poking around in Linnaeus's work, or I think I read something and it sort of put me on to this thing that Linnaeus said about classifying humans as Homo sapiens. And so giving us our own genus, Homo, as well as our own species, Sapiens. And he says at one point, this is basically to keep the theologians off my back, because if I did what kind of it looks like, which is just say, we share a genus with the great apes, right? So we should have a genus that includes chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans. And, you should have maybe Homo troglodytes as well as Homo sapiens. But, he could have set it up like that. But he didn't do that because he knew how controversial that would be. There is a way in which the taxonomic classifications are, they're certainly not arbitrary in the idea that anything goes, but there's a decision that gets made as to what really counts as a species or a genus or a family, and they're controversial decisions. In an important sense, there is most of the time no fact of the matter because of the way evolution works, right? Evolution works through this very gradual process of change and separation of two parts of a population into two separate populations, and then they're in two different environments, and they gradually change over time till they get to the point where you can say, yeah, sure, they're two different species. But where exactly that happens, there's no rule about that. There are various considerations, and in fact, you'll find biologists and philosophers of biology will talk about various different kinds of species concept, whether it's a biological species concept, which is all about interbreeding, or whether there's the eco-species concept, which is all about your kind of role in a niche, or whether you just want to say purely phylogenetic, which is problematic because you always need a criterion. So I hope that's the answer. We absolutely have to have taxonomy, but if you mistake what you're doing when you're making these classifications, it can make you say some pretty stupid things.
The interplay between science and policy and the law is, I think, a lot more complex than sometimes people might think. And we often say that that's one of the things that we appeal to, is that the law should essentially evolve in accord with our understanding of science. And the same with respect to, I think, something obvious like climate policy, right, should be informed by science, or response to a pandemic, maybe something like that. but it's very tricky, and I think this is something that we can continue talking about because I think it's so important. What role, is science just this kind of empty vessel that's, kind of blind to these different policy motives, or does it have, like some people say, reality has a liberal bent, or, people say these different things. Is there, how can we use science really as a guide and not just be kind of led? Because awful people like the Nazis thought they were using not science as a guide too, and they did experiments on, Mengele, so it's a really important but tricky thing. And I think you being a philosopher of science, we're in your wheelhouse.
Well, this is where, especially as a feminist philosopher of science, right, one of the things that feminists are particularly alerted to are the ways in which bias enters science, right? And the ways in which, if you have cultural bias, which is strong enough, you'll find that it's sort of infesting all of your scientific theories in a particular area. So you can't sort of say which is the best of the bunch because they're all really deeply flawed. And so, the anthropocentrism you found in like mid-20th century models of human evolution, and the anthropocentrism, right? Both very androcentric, extremely anthropocentric, and you still find a lot of these accounts of human evolution, which are really about human uniqueness, while at the same time having this way of characterizing human evolution to make it sound like it was driven by the activity of men. So, again, both androcentrism and anthropocentrism kind of working together. Now, the way to try to avoid bias is to make sure that your theories are criticized as rigorously as possible, right? And so having a diverse group of very different people with very different both scientific training and cultural backgrounds and political beliefs, if you have a real diversity of people assessing the evidence and saying, yes, this is a good theory in light of this evidence, then you've got one hell of a well grounded theory. But, we don't tend to really appreciate the amount of benefit you can get from really diverse criticism. So I would say, what you need to have a well-criticized science. I think you also, and this goes along with that, there are ways in which the institutions of science, and particularly now the way science gets funded, which has distorting effects on science. And that's something that as citizens, we need to be very much aware. So in Canada, where I work, you had a shift happening over the last 20 years from just federal funding for science to partnership funding, where you really needed, in order to get federal government money, you also needed to have a partner who was going to pony up the same amount. And of course, that skews all your science towards things that businesses can sell. And so that's going to skew your environmental science. It's going to skew your medical science, because you're going to find that, health solutions, for instance, that have something that can't be marketed just don't even get studied, right? And so I think for the science, when you're looking at the well-being of non-human animals and the way that intersects science, unfortunately, the way science is funded means that scientists will be incentivized to use as many animals as possible, right? That the kind of research that isn't about that just isn't going to make anyone any money and isn't going to get done.
And it's just hearing you talk about it, just it is a good reflection of just how deeply these problems go. And we just remain committed to the idea that getting judges, people in positions of authority, legislators to finally at least begin saying, well, not this species or not this species, will have real force to it, and hopefully help counteract some of these things. So I think we've maybe gone over a little bit. I know we have a whole bunch of questions. So Letitia has made herself available to continue. For anyone who wants to, might be easiest if you guys want to email them to us. We can forward them along. We will have more opportunities like this in the near future, I'm sure. And maybe one day we'll all get to be able to get together in person again. That would be nice. I miss Canada already. I was supposed to be up there and see maybe you in Toronto, but I know that got pushed off. So, so again, thank you. And briefly, just next Wednesday, we're going to have another seminar. It's going to be a really good one with our communications director, Lauren Choplin, who I'm sure a lot of you know from either hearing her speak or getting her emails. And she's going to be leading a discussion with Debbie Ethel. Debbie has been as an elephant expert. She's the executive director of the CODA Foundation for Elephants. And she's been helping us out for years in recruiting experts, helping us, digest scientific information about elephants. So, it kind of follows on this theme of how do we continue to, use science and kind of make it work for non-human animals. So Letitia, thank you again. And thank you everybody for joining. And we hope that you got a lot out of this.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for showing up.